I just got diagnosed with memory loss. Now, the doctor said it resets about every 14 minutes or so in case I forget, I wrote the topic that I wanted to talk about today on my arm. So, second-gen consoles it is today. First generation of consoles. Boom. Done. They did that already. Wanna know what they did next? They made the second generation of consoles. What? This gen had hits like Pong and Donkey Kong. The second generation lived from 1976 all the way to 1992. We're still experiencing that crazy overlap between generations, though there weren't any new consoles released during the third generation, simply just companies refusing to discontinue their consoles. With the first and the second, that damn Nintendo kept releasing first geners all the way until 1980. A lot of the games you'd see in this generation are arcade ports, primarily because the second gen was going on alongside the golden age of arcades. Titles like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Space Invaders were gobbling quarters, while games like Bubbles, I mean, it's Bubbles. Many of the same companies from last time returned. Atari, Coleco, and Magnavox all had stuff, Coleco and Magnavox having significantly less hats in the ring. Where Coleco had 14 last gen, they have 2 now. Newcomers arrived such as Fairchild and Mattel, who both had 1 console, and Atari came back with 2. One was a very popular console and defined the second generation, and the other one was really dog shit. Let's start all the way at the beginning with the Fairchild Channel app. Fuck is this, the news? Initially released as the Fairchild Video Entertainment System, they realized that name could never sell a console and surely won't go far, but especially when Atari released their video computer system a year later, they changed the name to the Channel F. The F means fun. I thought it meant fucking stupid. This was the very first console to use a microprocessor and to use ROM cartridges instead of having games built into the console. This changed everything. Instead of a few versions of Pong being included with the console and those being the only games to play, the ROM cartridges of the Channel F allowed for basically any game that can run on it to run on it. The Channel F only had 27 carts released for it, and none of these games were much of a system seller. The Channel F sold only around 350,000 units because once Atari came out with their video computer system, the Channel F was basically toast. In 1977, the Atari 2600 released, although it wouldn't be dubbed that until 1982. Many people just call this the Atari since it's the most popular Atari console by a mile. Atari thought that the monopoly tactic was the best way to go this generation, acquiring the rights to many popular arcade ports so that other consoles couldn't have them. They all told the other consoles, you can't play Pac-Man, followed by the most salt in the wound Nana Nana Boo Boo, which basically ensured Atari's success in this generation. That doesn't mean they were good console ports, like here's the original Pac-Man, and here's Pac-Man on the 2600. But also, Atari had plenty of their own popular arcade games that can only be on their own systems, such as Asteroids, Breakout, Centipede, and even Steeplechase. Maybe not Steeplechase. The system's first killer app wouldn't actually come until 1980 with the release of Space Invaders for the console, which was already a huge game in arcades. The success of the 2600 led to things like competition from Coleco and Mattel, the start of many third-party developers like Activision. Oh god. Mattel's Intellivision wouldn't be released until 1980, but guess who came back in 1978? Magnavox released the Odyssey 2 in 1978. This isn't the Odyssey series, the 2 is its own damn thing. Unlike any of the other systems, or unlike any system in general, the Odyssey 2 had a whole damn keyboard right on the console for educational titles, selecting options, or programming. If Casey's Crazy Chase or Pickaxe Pete aren't your thing, f*** you, make your own damn game. Oh, that's Magnavox's words, not mine. Most of the games by Magnavox had exclamation marks in their titles. I personally don't get that excited for Turtles, but I will get excited for Nimble Numbers Ned. I'm a bitch for alliteration. There were some arcade ports on the system, such as Frogger, Q*bert, and Popeye, though third-party titles were few and far between. Like, the first third-party game on this system came out in 1983. The Odyssey 2 didn't do that bad here in America, but it did way better in Brazil, where it was released as the Philips Odyssey, since they didn't get the first one over there. Also, the Odyssey had region locking, but only for specific titles, so if you were itching to play Frogger in Europe or Chess in America, sorry. Oh, thank I can play Frogger. Mattel released the Intellivision in 1980, being their first game console. They had their line of handhelds in the first gen, but those are less video games, more so toys. While not Atari's first competition, the Intellivision was the first console to actually pose a threat to the 2600, mainly because there was a big ace up Mattel's sleeve: advertising. They made a series of commercials that had the Intellivision and the 2600 running side by side, showcasing the superior graphics of the Intellivision. These ads wanted you to look at the 2600 like, I don't want that wimpy Atari, this one plays golf better. Atari also had ads, and a lot of them asked one simple question. Have you played Atari today? God, Atari, I surely won't remember with all this memory loss going on around here. They wanted the Intellivision to be a more mature console, so they didn't market it as a toy. Games such as Sea Battle or B-17 Bomber weren't designed as pick-up-and-play arcade games, and reading the instruction manual for some games was almost a prerequisite. The Intellivision had a ton of third-party support, like Sega made games for it, Parker Brothers made games for it, even Atari and Activision made games for it. Coleco would also make games for the Intellivision, though this was before the ColecoVision came out. There were also console add-ons for this thing. The IntelliVoice gave the console speech synthesis abilities, and the controller— Jesus The Intellivision started the most disgusting trend in controller design, having a whole damn number pad on the controller. Like a phone. I'm feeling a little observational today, if you couldn't tell. This design didn't really leave this generation except for Atari, who decided, let's get despicable when creating the Jaguar controller. The people responded, 150,000 units. The Intellivision was only the first of two consoles Mattel made, the other one being the Hyperscan, which was an incredibly horrendous console. And next we have Coleco. In 1982, they created the ColecoVision. It was another console that rivaled Atari pretty good. So much so that they made an add-on that lets you play 2600 games on the ColecoVision. Atari responded, that's cute, I hope you like the law. They also released a straight-up clone console that played 2600 games while the 2600 was being sold. Coleco was competing with Atari by using their own invention. Imagine for a second that Sony made their own Wii. Okay, you got me there. Coleco had more ports of the hidden gems of the arcade. The console launched with Sega Zaxxon, and they were even able to develop Donkey Kong for the system and include it as a pack-in title, which was agreed upon in a meeting with Hiroshi Yamauchi himself before Donkey Kong even released in America. This console was way more powerful than the Atari 2600, having closer arcade conversions than its counterparts. The ColecoVision even influenced the creation of Nintendo's Famicom, which is crazy for a console that didn't do all too well in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to its other counterparts. The Vectrex was an interesting console that utilized vector graphics. The games were all in black and white, but it had its own screen, so it didn't need to be plugged into a TV. The games for this title all came with color overlays for the screen to make up for the limitations, a la the Magnavox Odyssey. A game kinda like Asteroids came built into the system. The last console in this generation was another Atari joint. The Atari 5200 was released in November of 1982 and was just bad. Trying to ride the success wave of the 2600, the 5200, while it touted better graphics, the games on this console just felt like updated 2600 titles. It didn't help that the 5200 had no backwards compatibility, so it wasn't like you could play your old 2600 games. It also didn't help that around this time, Mattel released an add-on to their Intellivision redesign that let you play 2600 titles. The pack-in title, Super Breakout, was criticized for not doing much to showcase the advantages of the 5200. While the console was technically similar to the ColecoVision, that had a more authentic version of Donkey Kong packed in. The controllers were just really bad too. They used the phone pad and the joystick wasn't precise at all. While the 2600 would go on and not be discontinued until 1992, the 5200 got discontinued in just under 2 years. However, the 5200, Vectrex, and even ColecoVision fell victim to one of the greatest tragedies in all of gaming. In 1983, the video game market crashed. Uh-oh. A recession hit the industry so bad, consumers lost interest in video games, calling them a fad, and many prominent manufacturers in this generation straight up dipped. In 1983, the video game industry was worth about $3.2 billion. In just 2 years, it was worth $100 million. There were a few main factors for this. First of all, the console market became flooded. Not only did every one of these consoles have almost the same games, some were just different versions. I have mentioned some before, but the Sears Telegames console, that's just the Atari 2600. Same for the Coleco Gemini. The Intellivision 2 was just a redesigned Intellivision despite the name. Hubert released on 9 different consoles and every version was the exact same. The market was just not viable for competition and Atari was winning solely on brand recognition. Companies were using a pricing scheme called it, where they were selling consoles at a loss just to get more competitive. Then every company started releasing bad games just to get them out. The poster child of this is Atari's own E.T., which some deemed to be the worst game ever. Like really, I played Big Rigs a couple of weeks ago, at least E.T. was somewhat of a finished product. But E.T. was a really hyped game. It was the licensed game based on the highest grossing movie of 1982. It had high standards to live up to and failed to meet them all. They had only 6 weeks to do the entire game from the start of development to putting the game out out in stores just to meet a holiday deadline. Everyone hated it. Famously, millions of unsold copies were buried in a New Mexico landfill. Been there, done that. I lived ET 2600's life. Pac-Man on the 2600 was an extremely botched port of the game with massive sprite flickering and just being completely incomparable to the arcade version. And when I say every company, I mean every company. Quaker Oats and Purina dog food were making Atari games. Console manufacturers were making games for each other's consoles. This wasn't a war. This was a friendly argument over brunch. Coleco didn't just have the rights to develop Donkey Kong for the ColecoVision, they had the rights to make every console port at the time, so they deliberately made the other ports inferior. The Atari 2600 has you play as my uncle trying to save Maggie Simpson from an evil gingerbread man. And the Intellivision version? What? Atari gave way too much freedom to third-party developers with next to no quality control. Even Atari themselves had no quality control. Many games were coming out with major bugs that went unchecked. Some games would even crash the system. We as gamers complain about games coming out unfinished nowadays, but imagine that unfinished buggy mess being the final version of the game. Atari owners in 1982 didn't have to. Marketing for these games were downright deceptive, making customers feel cheated out. Anyone, and I mean anyone, can make a game for Atari and sell it in stores. There were so many games for the 2600 that could be summed up in one word: shovelware. That's not to say that other consoles didn't have shovelware, but Atari had it bad. There was even a lot of porn games being sold next to regular ones. Custer's Revenge was being sold right next to Cookie Monster Munch, which, if you're watching, you've been tricked into watching my new game show, porn title or not. Then the competition from home computers made people go, why buy this that only plays video games? Home computers could play the games you know and love on top of Microsoft Excel. This thing is great, why would anybody play on these stupid things? By 1983, the cost of a home computer was about the same as a console anyway, and while games on there didn't perform all too well, who cared? Computers could do so much more. Computers like the Commodore 64 and the Apple II were on par with second-gen consoles graphically anyway. The crash killed Atari's credibility and basically killed the original Atari, who by now were just keeping the 2600 alive. Despite the ColecoVision being pretty solid, the crash, among other factors, made Coleco drop out of the video game industry in 1985, and they focused on toys until going defunct in 1989. Mattel is still around, but that's because they're a multi-billion-dollar toy company. They're fine, though they did release that thing in 2006. The Vectrex just didn't stand a chance. Milton Bradley lost about 30 mil in that one. Now, the crash was pretty much localized entirely in America. The third gen started in 1983 over Eastern Japan, and over there, they call the crash the Atari Shock. Home consoles weren't the only consoles around this generation. There was the Microvision, the first handheld to support swappable cartridges, except all the cartridges were basically their own console. You popped into this sucker. It was discontinued because this thing was prone to damage from static electricity, and the LCD screen was prone to rot. The Palmtech Supermicro isn't a eulogy for my penis, but it is a very unsuccessful console. Had only 3 games, broke easily, and sold less than 40,000 units. However, the most popular handheld line from this generation was the Game & Watch series of systems made by Nintendo. The first one they made was Ball in 1980, and the last one they made was The Legend of Zelda in 2021. The Donkey Kong system was the very first appearance of the D-pad, and the system itself kinda looks like a DS. Can't be too sure though, we'll have to check in with my Is It a Nintendo DS consultants. The line was discontinued in 1991, probably because the Game Boy was the thing at the time. This also cemented Nintendo's success in the handheld market, as the Game & Watch was the best-selling thing this generation. The winner of the second generation was the Atari 2600, and even though Coleco and Mattel provided strong competition, both of them trailed behind the 2600. The Atari 2600 would carry the second gen before being discontinued in 1992, marking the end of the second generation. It lived through the third generation by positioning itself as a budget alternative to the NES. The gen lives on today in the form of those mini consoles, replicas of the real deal with a bunch of games slapped on it. The company At Games produces the Atari Flashback, ColecoVision Flashback, and the Intellivision Flashback. In my personal opinion, I think At Games should invest in a thesaurus. However, in 1983, Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan, and 2 years later released it stateside as the Nintendo Entertainment System. They copied Fairchild, those bastards! And... oh shit, what was I talking about again? Oh, okay. And... shit, what was I talking about again?